Story number 1. The Haunting of John's House. My name is John, and I'm 23 years old now. This whole incident happened a couple of years ago when I was just 21. I'd recently moved into a property in the isolated parts of Florida, a house on land that held a dark history. This house, a massive structure from the early 1900s, stood on the ruins of an old castle. Locals whispered about unnatural deaths that plagued the castle. Murders, suicides, and people who'd been locked up to starve to death. I'd heard it was a place touched by pure, unfiltered darkness, yet the allure of it was somehow undeniable. Initially, I was to stay in the basement of the house. The first time I stepped foot there, a strange, bone-chilling sensation washed over me. An eerie presence seemed to permeate every inch of that space, and I couldn't shake the feeling of something unseen following me. I was lonely and depressed then, deeply weighed down by my own thoughts. Little did I know, something in the house seemed to thrive on that vulnerability. I often sensed an invisible presence hovering close by, especially in my room, and I started dreading the pitch-black darkness each night, as if the shadows themselves held a life of their own. As time went on, odd occurrences began to shake my daily routine. I lost things, like my personal diary, which I'd never misplace, given how much it meant to me. Stranger still, objects began moving in my room. Books would drop from shelves, items would slide off tables, and there was this strange, creeping tension in the air. About a year in, a friend of mine, who lived next door, came over to spend a few nights, hoping to lighten my spirits and maybe distract me from the hauntings. We spent the night gaming, trying to keep our minds busy, but that's when we both heard a distinct dragging sound above us. Heavy, metallic, as if some large iron object were being scraped across the attic floor. My friend was skeptical, but the look of fear in his eyes told me he couldn't fully deny what he'd heard. Months went by, and I finally found my diary in the oddest spot, right in the center of my doorway, almost like it had been left as a twisted message. I'd never leave it there. The unsettling happenings escalated one night when my friend left a bowl of KFC on the kitchen counter. When he returned, we both saw the bowl moving, slowly sliding toward the edge of the table. My friend was visibly shaken. Despite his disbelief in the supernatural, he was spooked, and that, oddly enough, made me feel a little less alone. Determined to feel safer, I moved from the basement to sleep in the living room. The first night there, I saw her, the figure of a woman in a flowing white dress, her long, claw-like nails trailing at her side. She moved silently across the room, vanishing the second I tried to focus on her. My heart raced, and every nerve in my body screamed with fear. My brother was asleep on the couch beside me, oblivious to the haunting nightmare in our own living room. Directly across from me, the kitchen door leading to the basement swung open by itself, and as I forced my gaze away, I saw the bathroom door slam shut, seemingly locking itself. I heard water running inside the bathroom, even though I knew no one else was awake. Unable to ignore the strange sounds, I eventually braved the bathroom. Everything appeared ordinary until I turned on the faucet, and instead of water, a thick crimson liquid, like blood, flowed out. That sight was the breaking point for me. I bolted from the bathroom, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself it was all a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. In desperation, I decided to document these hauntings to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. I took photos and uploaded them to Facebook, not expecting much, but within moments, messages poured in. My friends pointed out a shadowy figure in the photos, a twisted, horrifying image of a woman standing behind me, her face twisted in a sinister grin. That night, I fell into a restless sleep, only to be trapped in relentless episodes of sleep paralysis. Night after night, for a whole month, I'd lie awake, paralyzed, unable to scream or move, forced to stare into the darkness as that woman's figure slowly materialized, lifting me from the couch with inhuman strength, as if I were weightless. The worst came one night when I felt an old man's presence. He was skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. In my paralyzed state, he threw the woman's apparition aside, as if she were made of nothing. I finally jolted awake, hitting my head on the floor as I escaped the paralysis. Shaken and trembling, I ran to my mother's room, something I'd never thought I'd do at 21, but I was desperate for some sense of safety. After this, my cat became affected as well. One night, I woke to the sound of her frantic mewing. She was frozen, eyes locked on the basement door, which slowly creaked open. Her little bed began to slide toward it, as though she were being lured in. Watching my poor cat in such terror brought me to a breaking point. I couldn't bear to see her in harm's way, so I decided enough was enough. I had to do something. The next morning, I sought help. I contacted a local priest, Father Williams, who specialized in exorcisms. He arrived, holy water and all, and began an intense 2-hour session in our home, especially targeting the basement. During the ritual, strange voices filled the air, angry shouts and agonized screams, as if the spirits were fighting tooth and nail to resist being expelled. The priest's expression shifted frequently, his face contorting as though he were battling the entities head-on. After a grueling battle, Father Williams assured us that he'd weakened and confined the spirits within the basement. Finally, I felt a wave of relief. Father Williams left us with one critical warning. Under no circumstances are you to open the basement door again. These entities are subdued but not eliminated. If we ever wanted them gone for good, the basement would need to be burned, with the ritual overseen by an experienced exorcist. Life returned to a semblance of peace. Though faint sounds would sometimes emerge from the basement, they eventually faded, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. But I know one thing, this story is true, and it's up to you whether you believe it or not. Spirits, some malevolent, some harmless, do exist, and the ones that intend harm can wreak havoc on your life if you're not careful. Story number 2. They called it Brent High, a decaying mansion that loomed in the woods just outside Williamsburg, Virginia. Locals whispered of its dark history, of the many who had disappeared within its walls, never to be seen again. Some claimed it was cursed, others said it was inhabited by something worse. Yet no one who dared to spend a night in the manor had ever returned. Despite the tales, 24-year-old Ethan, ever the thrill-seeker, scoffed at the stories, dragging along his more cautious friend Chris, 22, to spend a night there. It was a clear, crisp October evening as they pulled up the narrow, gravel road that led to the manor. In the fading light, Brent High looked less like a house and more like a hulking corpse left to rot in the woods. The windows, caked in grime and shattered in places, resembled lifeless eyes staring back at them. The once white walls were now a dirty, peeling gray, and with ivy clawing its way up the sides as if trying to drag the structure into the ground. "Creepy enough for you?" Chris muttered, clutching his backpack tightly. Ethan smirked, brushing off Chris's concern. "It's just an old house. They probably exaggerated the stories to scare kids away." He grabbed their supplies, including 2 bottles of whiskey, and marched toward the entrance, pushing open the front door, which groaned in protest. The moment they stepped inside, a chill enveloped them, the air heavy and damp, carrying an unmistakable scent of decay. The grand foyer stretched before them, shadowed and silent, with a dusty chandelier hanging precariously overhead. The floors creaked under their weight, and their footsteps echoed throughout the empty halls, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. They wandered through the main rooms, making jokes to break the tension, but it felt as though every corner hid a pair of unseen eyes watching their every move. They joked, drank, and explored the desolate space, occasionally taking selfies against the decayed wallpaper and tarnished mirrors. But as the hours wore on, an eerie silence settled over the house, and an odd, icy sensation crept up their spines. At precisely midnight, they settled in a large room at the back of the house. Ethan plopped down on an old, moth-eaten armchair, swigging from a bottle of whiskey, while Chris checked the room with his flashlight. The light flickered as it swept over faded portraits on the walls, each depicting solemn figures with hollow eyes that seemed to follow them. Dust motes danced in the beam, adding to the suffocating stillness. Then, the silence was broken by a low, deliberate creak from the stairs outside the room. Chris froze, flashlight trembling in his grip. "Did you hear that?" Ethan laughed nervously, but his bravado faltered. "Old house, man, it's probably just settling." But there was an unease in his voice that wasn't there before. They fell silent, straining to hear as the creaking continued, slow and deliberate, inching closer with each sound. It was as if someone was deliberately walking up the stairs, But whoever, or whatever, it was moved at a disturbingly slow pace, drawing out each step. Then, a faint scream reverberated from upstairs, a sound so filled with anguish that it made the hair on their arms stand on end. Chris gripped his flashlight harder, his knuckles white. "Ethan, maybe we should get out of here." Ethan opened his mouth to respond when a voice floated down from the upper floor, a soft, almost melodic whisper that echoed through the hallway. It was a woman's voice, cold and detached, as if calling from another world. "Come closer. Don't be afraid." Ethan's face turned ashen. For a moment, they stood frozen, paralyzed by the beckoning voice. But a sense of primal fear finally snapped them out of their trance. They bolted for the main door, but just as they reached it, the door slammed shut with a force that sent vibrations through the entire house. "What the hell?" Ethan shouted, pulling at the door, but it refused to budge. He kicked and shoved it, his panic rising with each second. Then, a sinister whisper drifted through the air, so close it felt as though it was right behind them. "No escape." The words clung to them like a curse, echoing in their minds as they frantically scanned the room. In their panic, they nearly missed the slow, rhythmic thudding from down the hallway. It was a hollow, metallic sound, as if an axe was being dragged across the wooden floor. Chris's voice was barely a whisper. "Ethan, someone's here." Heart pounding, Ethan shone his flashlight into the hallway, and there, just at the edge of the light, a shadow lurked. It moved slowly, a faint glint catching on something in its hand, a large, rusted axe. They dashed down the hallway, trying every door, but each one was locked. Their frantic footsteps echoed off the walls as they finally stumbled into a small bedroom and slammed the door shut, pushing an old dresser and a couple of chairs against it for good measure. They crouched in the darkness, trying to control their ragged breaths. But the smell hit them first, a rancid, rotting odor, stronger than anything they'd encountered so far. Chris gagged, covering his nose. "What is that smell?" he whispered. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he pointed it toward the floor. There, just below the rotted rug, was a dark stain, spread across the wood in a haphazard pattern. Chris hesitantly peeled back the edge of the rug, revealing deep, jagged cuts in the floorboards. His breath caught as he realized what he was looking at: bones, twisted and broken, half buried within the floor itself. There were remnants of clothing, a tarnished wedding ring, and fragments of flesh dried into the wood. The room seemed to pulse with a sickening energy, as if it were alive, feeding on the decay hidden beneath. Before they could react, a low, guttural moan filled the air, resonating from the walls. The flashlight flickered as they stared at each other, the realization of their fate settling in. Suddenly, the barricade they'd made trembled, the heavy dresser inching forward as a force from outside began pounding on the door, shaking it with every blow. Ethan and Chris scrambled backward, their eyes fixed on the door as each thud grew louder, accompanied by the scrape of metal against wood. It was the sound of the axe, relentless and hungry. The pounding stopped, replaced by the slow scraping of the axe head dragging along the floor just outside their sanctuary. The handle of the door rattled, and then, in one heart-stopping moment, it fell silent. Ethan's chest heaved as he gripped Chris's arm. Maybe it's gone. But before they could take a breath, a shuddering blow crashed through the door, splintering wood and sending shards flying. The dresser toppled forward, and the door burst open, revealing the figure in the doorway. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His face was twisted, skin gray and flaking, eyes cold and dead. His clothes hung in tattered strips, covered in dried blood. He raised the axe, grinning as he stepped forward. They stumbled back, only to trip on the skeletal remains strewn across the floor. The man, or whatever he was, stalked forward, each step deliberate, savoring their terror. Ethan threw a chair in desperation, but the figure didn't even flinch. "Please," Chris whimpered, but his plea was swallowed by the darkness. The figure swung the axe, its blade catching Ethan's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Blood splattered across the walls as the figure raised the axe again, methodically hacking and tearing, each blow resonating in the silence. Chris backed into the corner, too terrified to move, his eyes locked on the horror unfolding before him. The man turned his cold, empty gaze on Chris, grinning as he approached, his voice a chilling whisper. "No one escapes." The final blow came, and with it, the house fell silent once more, save for the creaking of the old boards, settling back into their haunted rest. By morning, Brent High had claimed 2 more souls, their lifeless bodies lying amid the bones of those who had come before. The house stood quiet, waiting for its next visitors, as the curse of Brent High lingered, feeding on the lives of the foolish and the brave alike. And if one listened closely enough, they might still hear the faint echoes of desperate voices, trapped forever within the cursed walls, pleading for a release that would never come. Story number 3. I am currently on vacation in Haiti, a place cloaked in mystery, renowned for its tales of voodoo and occult practices. Stories of dark rituals and curses are woven into its history, fueling an air of eerie fascination that has even inspired movies. My family has deep roots here. My grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and us all live on the same street. We stay on a secluded ranch, surrounded by dense, ancient trees, with the nearest airport a long, 4-hour drive away. When we arrived, my Uncle Jeremy came to pick us up. As we drove back to the ranch, he and my dad reminisced about their childhood here, their shared memories blending with the heavy, humid air of the evening. But the warmth of nostalgia quickly dimmed when my uncle started talking about a doll. His voice grew tense as he described the horrors his family had been enduring. According to him, the doll, a twisted, malevolent thing, had been tormenting them. It haunted their nights, with relentless knocking on windows and doors, chilling screams echoing through the darkness, and sightings that left those who encountered it shaken. My uncle even mentioned that someone had tried to shoot the doll, but it vanished before their eyes, leaving them even more frightened. I was unnerved, but tried to laugh it off, telling myself he was exaggerating, maybe even teasing us a bit. Yet, a nagging sense of dread crept into my thoughts. For the first 2 nights, we stayed at my aunt's house since our own house had recently undergone renovations. I found myself unable to sleep, haunted by unsettling dreams. Each time I closed my eyes, I was plunged into a twisted nightmare where I saw a grotesque doll, its mouth smeared with what looked like fresh blood, and in its tiny hands, a gleaming knife. I awoke drenched in sweat, unsure if I had dreamed it or seen it lurking in the dark corners of the room. When I told my dad, he suggested we move into our own house the next night, hoping a change of environment might ease my mind. That 3rd night, as we walked to my grandparents' house, we met my Uncle Tom, who was a little tipsy. He slurred a warning, saying we were tempting fate by walking around after dark. "The doll, it's gonna get ya," he muttered, chuckling darkly. Brushing it off as drunken rambling, we continued on, but the atmosphere felt thick with an invisible menace. Later that night, back in our own house, I tried to sleep. The silence felt too deep, almost unnatural. My room faced a big glass sliding door that looked out onto the backyard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from beyond the glass. A few days into our stay, my little cousin Jack joined us in the backyard while we were burning some trash. Out of nowhere, he pointed to a massive, gnarled tree near the edge of our property and said, "That's where the doll lives." He told us of terrible things happening to anyone who dared walk under that tree after sunset. People had fallen, breaking bones, and some claimed vicious dogs appeared out of nowhere to attack them. The most chilling tale was about a man who became so obsessed with the doll's presence that he hanged himself from that very tree. The detail that haunted me the most was Jack's question, where did he even get the rope? It was hard not to feel shaken by the stories, and that night, the doll came up again. My cousin Jack, who had been fairly quiet until then, went pale and refused to speak when my brother teased him about the doll. Suddenly, the whole mood changed. Jack wasn't joking or trying to scare us, he was genuinely afraid. He claimed the doll was an ancient entity, cursed by voodoo, and it had latched onto their lives like a parasite. From that moment on, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes watching me from the shadows. A few days later, another strange occurrence rattled us. We had gone on a brief trip to Guatemala, and when we returned, an overpowering stench filled our kitchen. It didn't smell like spoiled food or unwashed dishes. It was foul, like something rotting deep in the walls, almost like decaying flesh. Reluctantly, I started cleaning the dishes in the sink, hoping that would help when, to my horror, Hundreds of tiny larvae began pouring out of the drain. They squirmed in a writhing mass, and the stench intensified. I couldn't understand where they had come from. Our house was newly renovated, with sturdy brick and cement walls. When the last larva disappeared, so did the smell, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. It was like a scene from a horror movie, and we were living it. My cousin later said that the creature people saw around the ranch could shapeshift, sometimes appearing as a grotesque monkey-like figure, other times as something entirely unrecognizable. We began to wonder if this doll was more than a physical entity, something that could shift its form and become part of the landscape itself. Each night grew worse, the air in the house feeling thicker, charged with something dark. I started hearing faint whispers when I was alone, words I couldn't quite catch, spoken in a voice too low and too sinister. I convinced myself it was the wind or a trick of my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Objects began moving. A doll I had brought from the United States would be in a different position each morning, sometimes lying face up, staring directly at me as if challenging me. One night, my brother woke me, pale and trembling. He claimed he had heard La Llorona, the weeping woman, while walking back to the house. It could have been a prank, but the fear in his eyes was genuine, and it sent chills through me. That night, we barely slept, listening to every creak and moan of the house, dreading the sound of footsteps that seemed to come and go in the hallway. On our final night, we felt an urgent need to leave. Our home, once familiar and warm, had become something alien, something wrong. I remember sitting in the dark, staring out the glass door at the tree where the doll was said to live, and I swear I saw something, a small, shadowy figure shifting among the branches, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. Early the next morning, we packed hastily, barely speaking. Whatever haunted that land, whether a doll, a spirit, or something beyond explanation, had marked our stay with memories we would never forget. As our car pulled away, I couldn't resist one last glance at the gnarled tree. For a split second, I thought I saw it, a hideous little doll, standing at the base of the tree, watching us leave, its eyes filled with a malice so deep it felt as though it could reach us even from afar. Some things are best left untouched, and some stories best left unproven. For us, the curse of the doll was real enough, and no one in our family has ever dared to return to that haunted ranch.